Now, I like to consider myself a fairly helpful person. I say please and thank you as often as I can remember. I'm the kind of person that helps a person with a heavy bag get their luggage up the curb at the airport, or steps aside when someone's in a rush so they can get in line ahead of me. Relatively reasonable, actually. But then there are these times when maybe I'm frustrated or I feel like things are moving too slowly, or maybe I'm even a little afraid. And when that happens, there's a phrase that goes through my house, and it goes something like, would you just stop helping? I get that a lot, just stop helping. Now, I honestly think that Peter would totally get me, because I think Peter understands this thing that happens to me, especially when I get a little afraid, about trying to do something with all of that discomfort. I mean, here's a guy who was drug up a mountain by Jesus to have this very, let's just be honest, kind of bizarre experience. I mean, they're on the mountain, and all of a sudden, Jesus turns into this transfigures, turns into this thing. He's white. He might be a ghost. He might be an angel. No one can really tell. He looks really different. And then Moses and Elijah show up, and no one knows what to do with that. And it tells us very clearly that Peter was scared. He's terrified, actually. And so what does Peter do? Well, he does something, right? He's like, I know, let's build some tents, because this is kind of cool, even though I'm scared, and I don't want it to end, and besides, I don't know what else to do. And I think part of the difficulty that I've always had with this story is the way it shows up. I mean, this story comes from the 9th chapter of Mark, and just last week we were barely into chapter 2. And so this story that actually, in context, sits in the middle of Mark, gets dropped in here for us on this last Sunday before Lent without any context whatsoever. And as you know from last week, I think context is incredibly important to understand the story and to understand what Peter's up to here. Because if we were reading this in order, here's what we would know. That just 6 days before this experience, Jesus sat his disciples down and told them that he was going to die. He told them that he would be persecuted and executed. But that's not all. He also told them that if they wanted to live, they had to die too. And he challenged them to take up his cross and to follow him. And so really, I mean, Peter's actions, his response makes perfect sense to me. After hearing that, after being had to be so upset about understanding that this man that they followed and loved was going to die, and that things were not going to be very easy for them either, dangerous, most likely, that then you get up on the mountain and you have this amazing experience. You have this glimpse of God's glory. And Peter just wants to stay there. And I think, well, good Lord, wouldn't we all? I mean, really what Peter wants to do here is create a shortcut. Create a shortcut past all the things that Jesus had just told them was going to happen so that he could get to this place and stay here. And I think, well, who wouldn't? I mean, who doesn't want a shortcut through radiation and chemo? Who doesn't want a shortcut around 12-step groups? Who doesn't want a shortcut around couples counseling? These things are hard, and they scare us, and we're uncertain, and we just want it to be easier. So I don't think that we can blame Peter for his need to do something to make this thing last longer. And then our story tells us that right after he says, hey, let's build some tents, right? God shows up. And so there's this amazing moment that feels a lot like Jesus' baptism, this moment of this inbreaking of God, right? Again, God moving, closing that distance between God and the divine and us, the human, closing the gap between heaven and earth and breaking through. But this time, when God speaks, everyone on the mountain could hear. This is my son, my beloved. Listen to him. And so Peter gets a little education we all do. That even though we want the shortcut, even though we don't want to have to deal with the painful, brutally painful sometimes things, even though we want it to be different. I mean, who doesn't want a shortcut through this COVID disaster that we find ourselves in? But what Jesus tells us is that there's something else. It doesn't work like that. But the good news here, as is often the good news, this God that is with us, in us, and as us, is the God of both the mountaintop and the valley. That there's no easy way when we follow Jesus. There's no easy way. And Jesus doesn't want us to take the easy way. Jesus points after the story, he says to them very clearly, and don't tell anybody. And I think that's weird and perplexing too, until we consider who Jesus is and who Jesus has always been. Jesus doesn't want all that glory and adulation. Jesus never meant for any of that ministry and that work and that compassion to point to him. It was always meant to go through him. And it's the same for us. That it's not about being able to wear our badge of honor as a Christian. It's about recognizing that everything we do is in response to the God who loves us, to whom we are beloved, and that we go through Jesus to God. We have to hear this story in the context of the full gospel. And we know how this thing ends. It's both bad until it gets better. And so I think we just can kind of embrace Peter for a bit. To recognize that it's okay that we want those shortcuts. It's okay that there are days when we beg God to move those things out of our way, when we want life to just be a little easier. But the good news is that even though there's no shortcut, there wasn't for Jesus and not for the disciples, and there's not for us. The truly good news is that God with us, in us, as us. God with us on the mountain when it's amazing, and in the valley when we think we're dying, or even when we really are. God is present in all of that. And the tents that we want to build to God only belong right here.